Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome members and welcome members' guests, and with impeccable timing. Look at that, bang on. It's always great to start on time because otherwise we'll never finish on time. So I'm Andy Murray, Executive Director of the MPA, and it's my pleasure just to do a little bit of housekeeping and a short welcome this evening. So first bit of housekeeping, there are no planned fire drills this evening, so if it does go off, you can see you can either go through here, there's two at the back, and through the main door, back down to the ground level, and the muster point is outside the Westminster Arms, where Sasha says she's got to do a register of everyone, so don't run away, do hang around if you find yourself there. We will be having time for questions, and we do have some roaming mics, so some colleagues will come round for when we get to that stage. Please do wait for the mic to reach you before asking your question, so that's one for our guests to hear it properly, but also we are recording this evening, so to save your first question, will it be recorded? Yes, it will, and we're putting it on the MPA's YouTube channel to share it after. So that's it in terms of housekeeping. It just leaves me to sort of introduce you to the topic this evening, hand over to our chair. So we've been impeccable timing, almost like we planned it in election year. I'd just like to welcome you to this evening's lecture on the politics of projects.
Thank you, and I really do want to congratulate Andy for that timing, because I know it was very much his idea to ask Ben to come along this evening. I'm Emma Howard-Boyd, and I am chair of the Major Projects Association. And I'm here to welcome you, to welcome our speaker, but also one of the things that we have been doing at our events is making sure that we have an inclusion moment. And given that we're here at the Institution of Civil Engineers, one of the things I often talk about is the number of female presidents that we've had in the last 159 years. So all of them occurred in the last 20 years, kicking off with Jean Venables in 2008. Then we had Rachel Skinner, I think in 2017. And our current president here, the 159th, is Anusha Shah. And she is also the first person of colour. And every president gets a portrait. So one of the things I encourage you to do, if you haven't done already, is play Hunt the Portrait after this lecture. Always fun to find out where people end up. But the other thing I wanted to focus on was those of our members who have brought in tonight as their guests, as part of their teams, members of the Rising Stars and recent graduates. And I think that is really important given where we are right now. Facing an election here in this country, a year of a phenomenal amount of elections, and I'm sure this is something that Ben will talk to in his speech, and certainly may come up in elections. I spent some of last week with the former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, and I've done a lot of work on the climate change agenda, and have always, when I've spent time with her, she's now chair of the elders, learnt some phenomenal things about how we should work with our younger people. The thing that stands out in my mind, and I often talk about, and I think will last me, and I've learnt from so much, is when she was asked to be a daily commentator on the Sky Climate channel throughout COP26. And at one point, she felt that younger people and Indigenous people were not being represented in the commentary across those important climate change discussions. And at that time, I was part of a WhatsApp group called Fearless Women, and she sent out a message saying, could you come to the Sky bureau for a certain time on a certain day. And we all turned up, had no idea what she was going to do. But she worked onto the little platform where Sky was hosting these interviews with Helena, a young indigenous member of the Brazilian community. And in front of everybody, in front of live television, just gifted her 10 minutes to Helena, who spoke so passionately and eloquently about the issues that her country was facing. So those of you who are part of the younger end of the spectrum in this audience, I really encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A session. Often we hear that it's when women ask the first question, more women will participate. But similarly, when we've got the younger end of the spectrum participating early, it really feels inclusive and important to make sure that everybody is participating in the discussion. I could say so much more about what I'm hoping we're going to hear from Ben throughout this lecture, but I think the best thing is to introduce him so that he can talk through the subject, what he's prepared for us, and then we have an opportunity to open up to Q&A for about 20-25 minutes. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Ben Ansell, and formal role, Professor of Comparative Democratic Institutions at the University of Oxford, has one of the most popular reads on Substack, on politics, political calculus, and is most well known recently for the Reith Lectures that he gave in 2023, which inspired Andy to ask him to be with us tonight. So Ben, over to you. Thank you very much.
I'm going to time myself because you can't trust professors for a whole variety of reasons, but not least of which is timekeeping. Thank you, Emma, for that very kind introduction. I'm speaking to you with some trepidation for three reasons. Firstly, because I'm keeping you from dinner, but that's every speaker's problem. Secondly, because you are all experts on projects in a way that I, as a professor, am not. I'll show you some of my direct current experience with the project at the moment, but I talk to you with that in mind. What I do know a little bit more about is politics. So it's always great to be able to speak about politics during PERDA, which is the current situation that we're in. I don't think there's anything that I'm going to say that's going to get anybody thrown out. But what I do want to emphasize is a lot of the political challenges around project management and development and finishing in the UK are decades old. And they don't belong to any particular party, but they might belong to our political institutions more generally, and that's a theme that I'll pick up on. So here's my sort of opening slide. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make the background transparent enough to figure out what's going on, but not so that you couldn't see it. That giant microchip-like entity up there from Google Maps is London Euston Station, and to its northwest is what looks to me like a motocross track, which would be nice for everybody locally, but is, of course, the phantom limb that would be the HS2 terminal. And I've described this on my Substack as the skeleton in the scaffold of British project management, because it's going to look like this for a long period of time, given that HS2 is now going to terminate at Old Oak Common. So I like to think of what's happening in Euston as emblematic of some of the challenges we have with managing really long-run projects when politics ultimately is short-term and about democratic accountability, and that doesn't wait till the end of projects. Hence HS2 as a backdrop, and my apologies for any of you who've had to be dealing with HS2 over the last decade. I'm sure it's been challenging. I want to now, though, come to my own experience as an end user of projects, and then I'll talk about my experience as somebody who managed a project or worked on a project. This is the view from my lovely office, right? So this is where I can do my office boast about working at Nuffield College. It looks, as Lord Nuffield had designed it, to look like a 1930s Cotswold manor. Did very, very well there. But there was one slight problem, which you can sort of see around the doorways, which is that it's not very accessible. This was not, first and foremost, Lord Nuffield's architectural design was not getting into entryways. And so in order to make the college more accessible, we've done this, which is raising the ground around the whole of the college by an entire foot. in size. Now, this has been going on for a year, so I get the sound of jackhammers outside of my office every day. I notice that there's nobody from Beard here, which is probably good news. But certainly, this project has not kept within the precise timing parameters that were given to governing body. And I dare not think how expensive it is, but somebody I invited to dinner said, I don't know what you're complaining about, it could have been worse. Nuffield could have decided to lower the buildings by a foot. So I suppose we didn't do that, but this is my current life, is being surrounded by this. My previous life, and this is almost 2 decades ago now, which is making me feel very old, was just over the street at Her Majesty's, as it was then, Treasury, where I worked between 2004 and 2006. I don't know if there's any HMT people from that era here. But what I worked on was the Leach Review of Skills. Now, this was an attempt under Chancellor Brown, as it was at the time, to come up with a long-run plan to develop Britain's intermediate skills. I even wrote a document called Skills 2020, which at that point felt like the future, as opposed to 4 years ago. And the Leach Review was, how do we get there? How do we provide the long-run training that British teenagers and people in their early 20s need to, essentially try and mimic the continental vocational training model. That's what was going on about this. This is not a new story in British skills and training. This has been tried out in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. It's been tried out under the Conservatives. It's been tried out under Labour. And we gave it a good go too. What we produced was an enhancement of what were called the sector skills councils, which I spent a lot of time talking to members of various sector skills councils at the time, and a program called Train to Gain, which incentivized employers to train their employees by basically subsidizing it. 1 million people went through Train to Gain. We had all kinds of exciting quasi-experimental rollouts of whether the training worked. So excited with the policy. Came out in 2008, 2009. Coalition government came in, and it ended immediately afterwards. A few years later, the government was like, gosh, we need to do something about training. We need to reinvent apprenticeships, and on we go. Right? So what I want to note is that this difficulty of aligning long-term interests in things that involve investment, whether it be people or places, is always troubled and stymied by short-term political cycles. And I want to talk a little bit about the way in which our institutions lead us in that direction. But one other thing I want to say here is this is a very popular policy. It's this kind of thing if you poll that everybody likes. But that's not always true with infrastructural policies, as we'll come to. And so what I don't want you to take away from this is, it's just the institutions. If we change them, we'd be fine. Because the problem is also going to be in the mirror. The problem is all of us and the ways in which we react to things being built near us. And I'll present a lot of my own data on that. And thank God we have such a good screen that you'll be able to see what I'm doing when we get to that. So all of this is by way of me advertising my book. Obviously, I'm an academic. I have a book to sell. And the remaining 25 minutes I have will determine whether you buy the book. So this is a high stakes moment for me. The book I wrote a year ago basically looks at how individual self-interest often makes it hard for us to achieve collective goals. And I look at 5 traps of the modern world. This is very Penguin subtitle. I didn't write this subtitle. It's very good. So democracy, equality, solidarity, so on. But prosperity is the ending chapter. And I talk a lot about some really challenging, large investment and sustainable growth issues, from climate change to skills provision to infrastructure to baby bonds. In all of these cases, it's about how can you politically guarantee the stability of investments. And that just turns out to be an endemically hard challenge for any political system that's not a dictatorship. And I sometimes work with the Blavatnik School of Government, and we regularly get students from Singapore and China who tell us how wonderful it is that they can plan for the future. And that is wonderful, but of course they don't get accountability moments about that future. So unless we're planning on giving up our own ability to hold governments accountable, that's not an option for us, and nor do I think it should be one. So this is a generic political problem. I have these kind of little motifs, and the motif for the prosperity trap is what makes us richer in the short run, temptations, makes us poorer in the long haul, but we can flip it around. What would make us richer in the long run, some form of investment, often ends up being very politically or economically costly in the short term. And that is the sort of forbidden fruit of investment politics. So I want to give you 3 reasons, 3 ways of sort of breaking that down. The first is a pretty obvious one, which is the comparative timescales that people who manage projects and politicians are under. Okay? Now, here is my little motif for today. You can't do projects if you can't project. That is, if you don't know what the future is going to look like, and it takes you 10 years to do something, it's going to make it very challenging, and indeed, you may just not engage in the project at all. And we have extremely low levels of private investment in this country compared to many of our peers, and in part, this comes down to volatility. Infrastructure timescales are a minimum of 5 years, probably 10 years, often more, and as you know, the electoral cycle is 5 years or less. Even with the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, RIP, that wasn't going to extend beyond 5 years, and I think most of us would be uncomfortable with having our accountability moment once every 10 years. So this is just a necessary trade-off in any democratic society. We don't get the Singapore or China benefit. That's good, but it does mean that we have a trade-off that we're constantly having to make. But I don't think it's just every 5 years, because the problem is that politics is actually much more regular than that. We have local elections pretty much every year in this country. That provides an accountability moment of sorts, or at least a moment for members of government to panic and run around ringing journalists at the weekend about what the Prime Minister should or shouldn't do. We have by-elections that produce the same, but on an even more unpredictable fashion, dependent on the vagaries of, well, what in the past was MP health, but now appears to be MP scandals of various kinds. And then we have a political media cycle, right? Tim Shipman has to write an article for every Sunday. There has to be a story. And often the story is about some big government project that's gone wrong, which will take the news cycle for the next week and will require ministers, and therefore civil servants, to respond in some fashion or another. So it never ends, and you all end up feeling like Brenda from Bristol. Here she is. You're joking, not another one. Oh, for God's sake, the famous 2017 line. I mean, if only Brenda had known that things weren't really going to improve that much, right? Constant elections. And it's understandable that particularly the people in charge of projects might just think, politics is just messing with us. If only we could do without it. Unfortunately, we can't. Second thing that is a way of thinking about the prosperity trap and where it's going to be better or worse is the degree to which this mismatch of the infrastructural and the political cycle is dependent on the political institutions that you have. So it's going to be worse if you have a central government that is the sole decision maker, because they don't have to listen to localities or regions. In other words, in unitary systems rather than federal ones, this kind of mismatch is going to be more challenging because there's no regional check that can say, actually, the project continues. It's also going to be worse if you have electoral systems that give you single-party majorities, because now you have a single point of decision-making governed by a single party. So there's not even what we political scientists would call a partisan veto. There's not another party in power. It's not always the case, right? 2010 to 2015, they still got rid of the Leach Review. So coalitions don't always save projects, but single-party government makes it more likely that volatility is going to happen. And where you have limited other countervailing checks and balances, okay? So where your courts are weak, or where you have a disempowered legislature outside of the main decision-making legislature, right? So where you don't have a second house that can do very much, or any other entity that can block things. Of course, that's the experience we have in the UK. We have what Lord Helsham called an elective dictatorship. And many years ago, I wrote a textbook chapter for a textbook on comparative politics for American undergraduates, and I did the chapter on the UK, and it had a tagline which was, "Why does this country with no rules follow them?" Well, sometimes, as we've learned, it just doesn't, right? And politicians really can exercise a huge amount of discretion. The absence then of knowing what the rules are going to be makes it very hard to plan. But there is good news. Don't worry, there's some good news. There are some veto players in British politics. The bad news is that they're local councils and councillors under the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947. So there are some very powerful veto players. I live in Oxford, so I just see it all the time. It's low-traffic neighbourhoods here, not building schools there, not allowing housing here. It's constant council warfare, and it becomes very, very hard to get developments to happen. And there's a particular reason for this that is not totally unique to the British case, but is quite unique to the way that the TCPA happened, which is that unlike our normal our normal common law, where you are innocent until proven guilty, right? That's how we always distinguish British and English common law from French civil law. When it comes to developers, they're guilty until proven innocent. What I mean by that is that you can satisfy the local plan, right, be innocent, and still be turned down. Right? You don't have what we would have had under the TCPA of the 1930s and what exists in many American states and exists in many European countries, general zoning laws where if you're compliant, it's automatically accepted. We always have this last-minute veto player, and that's what makes planning extremely challenging in this country because it's always at the behest of somebody on a local council. And I'll come back to localities in just 1 second. Because the final part, I don't want to let the voting public, including me, get away with it, because it's not just about our institutions, it's also about each of us as voters having opinions about infrastructural developments. And I'll move in just a second in the talk to talk about some of my own data on this. But when it comes to infrastructure, you might think, well, this should be a gimme. It's not quite a silver bullet, but we generally build national infrastructure because it will make us all richer. Nobody wants to get rid of the M1 or the Channel Tunnel. These things make the country richer, but of course they have specific winners and losers. And the way for infrastructure that winners and losers are laid out makes it especially challenging to bypass the losers. Because the losers of infrastructural development tend to be highly concentrated and extremely well organized. By concentrated, I mean geographically concentrated. You know where the infrastructural development is going to be built, so you know if you live nearby it and it's going to despoil your view or make your streets crowded with bulldozers and so on and so forth, or simply just reduce your property prices, all of these horrible things. Concentrated geographically and also organized because what else is locally concentrated? Local councils and voting for local councillors, and they are the main veto players for development. So this does make potential losers an extremely effective political group, and rhetorically they have an advantage as well, because they're talking about the domain of loss, which is extremely effective in electoral politics. They can point to sentiment, losing things, losing symbols, greenery. Here is a famous pear tree. I can never remember how it is. Cobbleton pear tree that was taken down for HS2. Voted Tree of the Year in Britain 2015, which I did not know was a competition we had. Only came 8th in the 2016 European Tree of the Year, which tells you something about the relative merits of this tree. But it was taken down. You'll all be delighted to know that in its new location, it has begun to sprout and live again. Wonderful thing. But this is a kind of emblematic symbol of what happens when you build things, which is things you like get cut down and taken away. Winners of infrastructure are diffuse. They're spread out across the country. They're diffuse geographically. People who benefit from building new houses, by definition, do not live in them yet. Right? So how are they supposed to organize around this? Extremely hard. They're also unable to organize politically because, again, they don't live near the local council. They can vote in national elections and try and change housing policy. In an environment where we've had 12 housing policy ministers over the last few years, good luck with that. So it is very hard for the potential winners. And on top of this, winners don't have sentiment rhetorically. They have numbers and statistics and projections. This will reduce house costs by this much. This will generate this much electricity and so forth. And I'm afraid to say that numbers and statistics, despite being a quantitative social scientist, I know they don't work rhetorically. Certainly not in the way that looking at a pear tree does. So that just makes the challenge much, much harder. So Britain is an extreme version of all of these problems, basically. We have highly centralized government with limited checks, so we have volatility. We have a local planning regime that empowers, I'm sorry to use the word, but I will, NIMBYs, and so we get local gridlock. And that means this stuff, right? It's very hard to get anything done. And we get lots of cancellations or reductions. HS2, the Wilton nuclear power station, maybe it's back online, Heathrow third runway. It's not that these things are necessarily great, right? I don't know if I want a third Heathrow runway, but it's extremely difficult to do, right? So if we make a decision as a country, we'd like to be able to commit and not end up with a motocross track next to Euston. And that's the problem that we're getting into. Here are some numbers from Britain Remade. I'm just going to put all of these up. By the way, Dartford crossing planning should really be Lower Thames crossing planning. My apologies, didn't fit on the line as nicely. But the message from this is essentially that things cost a lot more in this country, and they cost a lot more because of the uncertainty. There is more red tape, but some of that red tape isn't just requiring longer environmental studies. The red tape often comes from changing our minds during projects because of political buffeting. Okay? And so I'll talk at the end of the talk about some of the ways that you might avoid this kind of midstream changes, which is, I think, what really raises the cost of things. So What I want to do for about 5 or 10 minutes now is talk about some of my own data on housing, because this is where I can tell you what the public think. This is data from Watling and Breach's nice paper about house building in the UK, both public and private. You can see private in purple, public in green, since the 1860s, so in the longue durée, as a historian would say. This is new houses as a percentage of the existing stock. It was really high in the past, except during the wars. It was quite high after the Second World War. You can see the Town and Country Planning Act looming there. But notice that it was quite high because of all of the public housing development. Private housing did increase in the 50s and 60s, but then declined, along with public housing following right to buy and the end of social housing. And so you can see our last 20 years looks really quite poor by historical standards in building houses. Now, I don't fully believe that housing supply is the reason why house prices are high. I think there's a demand-side story too, but this is definitely a core component. And so you might think, well, why don't the British public want to build new houses when this is creating an endemic housing affordability problem that wasn't always true in the past, right? I live in a 1930s semi during that big spike in Oxford. It's very nice. It looks like all the other 1930s semis, but that's what you get. Okay, so in 2022, I asked 6,000 YouGov panelists in the UK. This sounds like Family Fortunes, but it's much more boring. How much would you support or oppose more homes being built in your local area? And here is what the survey said. The survey said that people were basically completely split between building new houses locally and opposing it. Duncan Robinson at The Economist, who's the Badger columnist, took on this, and he said, this is crazy, because there aren't actually that many examples in British politics where people are completely split down the middle. Here's one of them. Okay? And this is where you get your builders and blockers kind of language that the Labour leader came out with. There are big differences on this, and we'll explore those differences in a second. But I'll show you my pretty hex map first. I did an estimate for every constituency in the country about their level of support. They're coloured by who they voted for in 2019, and the size of the hexes is how much support there was for building new houses. You can see basically where that is, because you probably know something about the partisan map of Britain. London really likes building houses. So to some degree does the kind of northern belt of cities, and certainly so does Scotland. Where doesn't like building houses? The home counties. Right? Very much against that, but actually most of rural England. And there's a bit of a problem here, because the places where people most want houses being built are the places with the lowest levels of house building. I didn't show you my regression plot of that. I've spared you from it. But basically, there's a negative association in Britain between how much people want local houses and how many get built. And it's partly because it's really difficult and expensive to build in London and these other places. It's also really politically divisive, and that makes it hard to come up with a coalition for building new houses. These are just the average levels of supporting building new houses by a political party. We're in Purda. I am saying nothing here, except that there's quite a lot of variation. Right? And that suggests that this is something that is going to become very partisan and probably makes governments panic, because voters really do disagree on this. And actually, they disagree a lot more than any of the other demographics. So here is age. Now, I thought this would be like young people, 80%, pensioners, 10% wanting to build new houses. And there is a negative slope, but it's not very strong. Young people being about 10% points more likely to support building new housing is not very encouraging for people who think, if only young people had control, well, we'd maybe build slightly more houses. But it's not that dramatic. The big differences in Britain are political. Similarly, by home ownership. Here we have homeowners on the left, non-homeowners on the right. There's a gap. Again, it's what you'd expect, but it's not very large. Even the green belt. Here we have your local authority. How much of it is green belt? From none to more than 50%. Again, there's a negative slope. People who live in the green belt don't want housing built as much, but it's not dramatic. What's dramatic is political differences, and that should suggest for you why this might be very difficult to get a cross-party, cross-country coalition on this. Now, the next thing I did is I asked people to write a sentence explaining their views, which is very professorial of me. And here are some word clouds. Well, they say things like build, need, so that's not very surprising. But when we move to pairs of words, you start seeing a split, and we'll see the split again in a second. There's a bunch of people who say, need affordable, people need home. They don't just say that, but those are the combinations that come out. Those are the people who really care. But there's a lot of people now talking about school doctor, green space, green belt, doctor, dentist. And this is the split in how people think about development. And it's this latter group who block houses being built. So let's think about what they want. The next thing I did is I took a whole bunch of words and I looked at which words are most associated with being a non-homeowner, what kind of words do they say, and which kind of words are most associated with being a homeowner. So what are really non-homeownery words? Homeless, affordable, price, desperately, crisis, can't, and brilliantly IDK, which is a response, I guess, that you can give. Okay, so non-homeowners do have a language of, my God, there's a housing affordability crisis. But homeowners are not saying, yeah, I've got mine, I don't want prices to go down. They're saying something quite different. Infrastructure, road, school, doctor, appointment, village. That's what they're worried about. And here are some emblematic examples of things. These are direct quotes from the survey. Not enough local shops, doctors, dentists, infrastructure, buses, school places, sewage, dentist, hospital, doctors, schools, decent roads, parking, drainage. People aren't making this up. This is what people really care about. These are the reasons why people don't want new things built. But notice how challenging that will be for government. You want to build new houses? Sure, that's fine. Can you also build a whole bunch of new GP surgeries and a bunch of new schools and widen the roads and make sure the drainage works? And before you've got to the end of it, you've redeveloped all of the infrastructure in Britain. And that makes infrastructure a real problem from hell, because you have to do lots of things at once. You have to do a kind of big push. The climate transition is another place where we see people sort of want in general for the situation to improve, but not like the specifics. And this is sort of in Emma's domain. And this is another example where we know what's going to happen if we don't do anything about it. I mean, we know what's going to happen if we don't build any new houses, which is houses will become ever more expensive, but we don't seem to have done very much. I have some concerns for our ability to react on climate change in the same way. Again, people in general are fine about doing things. In fact, they're much more excited about doing something about net zero by a date very far off in the future than they are about building houses, 71% support. But the specifics are much more challenging, and here is some data from YouGov, where the red is things you don't want to do, and purple is things that you want to or are already doing. There's lots of sort of easy things, like, yeah, fine, I'll move to Octopus Energy, or I'll eat local food, I'll make my house more energy efficient. That stuff is easy. Maybe switching to an electric car is easy. Things that are harder to do, that are more directly costly, paying extra fees for flights, paying more for meat and dairy, paying more, being in the domain of loss, this is the kind of apple tree moment, that's where it becomes much harder. And we saw this so recently with the ULEZ moment with the Uxbridge by-election. Now, do I think that's going to play out a great deal in the coming election? I suspect it's not, but with by-elections, these kind of issues really matter, and I suspect over the next few years there will be more ULEZ-style moments. Okay, so what could we do? Let me finish the final few minutes. What can we do to try and bring the public on board with infrastructure? And what can we do in terms of designing institutions that push against some of those challenges I mentioned already? I'm going to give you examples from 4 different places. Firstly, there's the French model. The French are very good at producing transit and nuclear power much more cheaply than the UK. One of the mechanisms by which they do this, and this is certainly not the only one, is with the Commission Nationale du Débat Public, that was quite good pronunciation for me, the CNDP, which is made up of 15 experts from government. That French A-level wasn't wasted. 10 from unions and business, mostly engineers, so it's exciting for people in the crowd. What the CNDP do is, at the start of every major project, and the Conseil d'État, the kind of main state council, decides what a major project is, the CNDP are charged with setting up a deliberative public debate within a fixed period of time, within 4 months from the start. It will involve usually about 1,000 local people, so quite a lot of people. And the developers, again, have a fixed period of time in which they have to respond. So you can see on the right here, we have the Flamanville nuclear power station from start to finish. The building, the construction, is that nice light blue bar on the right. That's most of it. The CNDP part is the ready bit on the left, and that's quite constrained by British standards. Now, importantly about CNDP is basically it doesn't really have much accountability power. It can't tell developers what to do because it only has a budget of about €1 million. What it can do is have a debate at the start. Okay? That's basically its role. And so, in terms of how it works, between 2002 and 2012, of 61 projects that they had, 17 stayed exactly the same. 38 were modified after this debate and only 6 abandoned. I'd say actually that's a pretty good win rate. 90% of the projects survived, only a few were lost, but they did listen to people and they listened at the start when it was least costly to listen. We could also listen to people in the Irish model. We could have these kind of randomized citizens' assemblies. I would suggest we don't do this for small major projects. We could have done it for something like HS2. Here it's much more intense. You randomly select 100 Irish people in this case, you have them meet with experts over several days, and then you ask them, this is different to CNDP, to provide detailed suggestions to the legislature, which is why I would not recommend doing this for many things. But I think it worked quite well in Ireland, not least because the citizens ended up being more moderate than the politicians, both in what they came up with and in how they talked about it. So, two models for citizen involvement. The next model I want to talk about is the Norwegian model. The Norwegian model for managing money, which is a much nicer problem to have than building something. But this is Norway's oil sovereign wealth fund. It's run through Norges Bank Investment Management. The important thing about NBIM is it's independent from government in two steps. There's an intermediate body that is in charge of NBIM. So it's really quite detached from government. And I mean, I'm not saying we're all going to set up a sovereign wealth fund here, but another way it's independent is it's not allowed to invest in Norwegian companies. So it avoids these problems of potential corruption or particular interests. It also relies, and this is where I think we might struggle a little bit more, but we've done it with the Bank of England, on political party norms of non-interference. So what I want to suggest to you here is there are ways of setting up institutions to really immunize them from political control. And had we adopted a similar scheme, here's what you could have won, to go back to another game show of the 1980s. These are estimates from some colleagues at Oxford. About £350 billion we've left on the sidewalk. I have one more example I'm going to talk about, and then I'll conclude, which is how to do things locally in other English-speaking countries, because our local rules stymie development, but they don't have to. Here is my old house in Minneapolis. And after I left, perhaps thankfully for me, they passed an ordinance to prevent zoning for single-family homes only. So now you had to allow apartments. They eliminated minimum parking rules for apartments, and they created new building height minimums for any new development. The same happened in New Zealand. The Ardern government has this deal. It's sort of local in effect. For places like Auckland, any building up to 6 stories and high gets automatic approval. Right? So this is a way to sort of push through densification. And the opposite to that is what we live in with London, or in Oxford. There's a Carfax rule, just like the St. Paul's rule, which is you have to be able to view Carfax Tower from various angles in Oxford, right? So we're doing more or less the opposite of that. So, let me finish. Just hitting my 30 minutes, so I'll do this very fast. How do you get politics out of projects? You don't. Read my book. By read my book, I want to note that the analogy in my book is the toothpaste tube. That if you squeeze down politics in some part of the system, it just pops up somewhere else, right? People disagree about this stuff. I've shown you that with housing. We've talked about it in lots of ways. So we're not going to get rid of it, but you can tone it down a little bit. And we have this dance that we do between national volatility and local gridlock, and then this challenge of when to involve citizens. And right now, we have a lot of national volatility, we have a lot of local gridlock, and citizens get involved constantly throughout the process, delaying it. So it requires infrastructural bodies, we'll be talking about this presumably with a new government, that are insulated to some degree from changes in government, but don't get captured by concentrated interests. That would be great if we could do it. But let me leave you with one warning about if we do that. It won't have escaped any of your notice that the Bank of England and the Office of Budgetary Responsibility have both come under attack in recent years for being anti-democratic. They are. That's the point. They are about rules against discretion, and we as democratic citizens also have the right to push back against that. That will be true for any way of doing this with infrastructure. And so just because we insulate things doesn't mean we want to keep them insulated forever. We're not Singapore, we're not China, that's a good thing. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben. And I'm sure that has inspired a number of you to think about the questions that you're going to ask. But I take the first one as chair's prerogative. So please get ready and maybe even start indicating, putting your hands up, and my colleagues will be ready to hand out the microphone. A little bit about PERTA, or pre-election rules. Now, in one of my roles, I'm chairing a review on called the London Climate Resilience Review for the Mayor of London. I am caught by some pre-election period rules. So I do want us to respect the fact that there will be people in the audience, myself wearing at least one of my hats, where I can't talk about stuff that is to come, but I can talk about stuff that I've done in previous roles, but also I've published already. So Andy and I were talking a little bit about the Thames Barrier, which was built, just celebrated its 40th anniversary, and I think opened from the event that inspired the Thames Barrier and the system that protects London. It was opened in the early 80s, so roughly 30 years after the big flood event of 1953, which made us understand that we needed to do something to protect London. There's been some excellent work that's been done by people to look at what needs to happen next, given climate change. And spring last year, the Thames 2100 group looked at the system as a whole. And whilst our barrier is probably in okay for at least another up to 2070 is what the study says, the whole system protecting London, this side of the barrier, and the estuary, the other side of the barrier, needs an upgrade, needs to be lifted because of sea level rise. And that report said in the 10 years, this side of the Thames barrier, we need to bring forward that increase to 2050, so by 15 years. And the other side of the barrier, it's now by 2040. We have to raise those defences to make sure what's being protected now is ready for climate change. So given the models you've talked about, and given that climate change is happening ever more quickly, and we haven't begun to factor in heat in this country, extreme heat, which we know is a nightmare, a living nightmare for some parts of the world. How do we work through some of the stuff that you've been doing, where things are coming at us ever more quickly?
Yeah, well, let me respond by sort of scavenging off my presentation. And to politically sell costs is always hard. Right? People would always like free things. They would always like to have their cake and eat it, and they do not like to lose things. So that provides some logic to think about how to respond to climate change. The problem is the losing in climate change is created by the climate. It's the climate that's going to make us lose things that we like. And that's a difficult bad guy to point at. So it becomes quite hard to point to potential losses and motivate behavior. What I would advise doing is to spread losses as disguise them. I mean, I don't want to go full on stealth tax here, but I think the absolute worst way of paying for the Thames Barrier to be rebuilt would be to have a Thames Barrier levy laid on people. I think that would absolutely produce this immediate, oh my God, this is a direct cost that I'm facing. So I think it will have to be done out of general taxation. And you know, maybe you're thinking, well, no one would ever be so foolish to do that. That happens in the US all the time with any kind of large infrastructural development, is they will issue bonds for it, and then they will put those bonds up for election, and then they will lose the election, and they won't be able to build the schools or whatever else. So don't do that. Now, then there's a question about can you make people sentimentally attached to the Thames Barrier? I feel like you probably could do that. I think infrastructure often destroys things that people are sentimental about, but people become sentimental about the infrastructure itself once it exists. And so I do wonder if there are ways to kind of have a better sales pitch for doing something about the infrastructure that we use all the day and night. People have much more sentiment about things like bridges or railroads than they do about most other things that government does. And so I wonder if a kind of sales pitch in that direction would make some kind of sense. Brilliant.
Well, I'd love to see some hands go up, and I can see a number of, I'm going to take them in clusters. So we've got Kay over here, 2 rows behind Michelle. If the second microphone can go over here. We're going to take a cluster over here. Sorry, I've just... and then Michelle, if it could be passed forward. So the woman with the white jacket. Thank you. Okay, Kay.
Hello, my name's Kay Hughes.
Okay, I'm just going to stand so I can see you.
Part of the MPA board. I really enjoyed your talk so much, particularly as I recently left HS2 as a design director. I would love to see some continuity in infrastructure projects. One thing you didn't touch on was the difference between the French rollout of their high-speed railways or electricity and the legal system, and the difference in the two legal systems between here and there, because I do think that brings in a very lengthy series of deliberations for the duration of major infrastructure, which is very costly and makes it very difficult to deliver.
So that's the first question. Have you got a microphone? Can you? No, it's here. We're doing a cluster down at the front. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. My name is Kira. I'm from company Enzen. So my question is, it's interesting to see all the insights, brilliant insights, which you have outlined from working in the area. So what's the willingness for change from the politicians, having read your book? So what happens after this? I'm thinking there are so many projects after, whether they failed or not necessarily exactly performed up to expectations. So there are lots of lessons learned, but how do they project back to work and making sure that there are some actions made to do something tangible out of this? Because for me, reading these, seeing all these examples, I'm just thinking how many of them were touched and inspired to do the system, to make the system better. And if it doesn't happen, how can we incentivize that change? We, I mean, both on the board of the normal people and politicians. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Michelle, two in front. If you could pass it, just two in front. Thank you. Michelle, put your hand up, please.
Thank you. I might look old, but I'm young, really, to inspire young people to ask questions. It's a simple question, which is how can we convert losers into winners by having a more generous compensation system?
Yeah. Thank you. Those are three great questions. This speaks a little bit, I'll take them in order, but it speaks a little bit to the last part, which is that the legal way in which we manage infrastructure in this country is very reminiscent of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce in Bleak House. For those of you who haven't read this, it's the whole of Bleak House is about this 30-year-old legal debate about property. And it just is interminable, and we have a very successful legal industry in this country, and this certainly helps keep it afloat as a very successful legal industry. Ultimately, it is hard for politicians to undercut that legal system. You can have compulsory purchase orders, you can change things through statute, but we do have a very active and clever legal class of people. So I suspect it will always be hard. I do think that the French model is successful in part because of civil law. But the French had real issues with some of the early TGV rollouts, especially in the south of France, with people feeling they weren't listened to. That's why the CNDP was created directly in response to that. It does, I mean, look, France still has Gilets jaunes and so on. It has lots of discontent. But I do think that the potential losers being brought in right at the beginning of a project, when they're able to talk about the project not just in its logistics, but actually in its whole kind of size and shape, is the way to involve people. The problem is that the French, unlike probably the British, can draw a line and say, okay, well, we're done now, and now we're under civil law, and we can do this, and we don't have that ability. In terms of the questions about losers, I mean, I do think that, you know, so much of the solution lies in compensating losers. But the way in which we compensate losers is to have an extraordinarily long legal process about compensation, at which point the losers have lost so much in time and possibly also in legal fees that was it worth it in the first place. So, again, a model where what compensation would be is resolved early at the start of projects and a hard line is drawn is probably the one to resolve. How that works with our legal system, I don't know. Short-termism is very, very hard for politicians to avoid in this country, and we all do them a disservice by enjoying gotcha scoops in the media and all the things that we love, right? And so we're all part of the problem too, and our media certainly doesn't help. Look, bluntly, politicians are able to plan for the long run when they're not scared of losing office. And so it certainly is the case that large majorities have helped immunize politicians about having to worry about 10 years' time on the assumption they'll probably win the next 2 elections. The other thing to say about politicians is they always try and do the hard stuff right at the beginning of an electoral cycle. That will be true, this I don't think violates PODA anyway, regardless of who wins the next election. They will try and do the costly things at the beginning because that's the only time you can do them. So I suspect if we see any important differences, it will be within the next 6 months.
Brilliant. Another round of questions. I think someone still has the microphone over there, and perhaps we could take these two here in the front after that. So do you want to go ahead? Thank you.
Hi, James Carey from PA Consulting.
Could you keep your hands up? Sorry.
I found your discussion was completely real and true. Having done engineering, DCOs, environmental impacts, designs, options, sifting, the process is really interesting. I have a rail background, and we consistently compare how do they deliver electrification or whatever cheaper and that. And it all comes down to that ability to make decisions. There's lots of people from HB2 and others in the room, and I, as a rail person in infrastructure, I'm blown away of all of the processes that it takes to get gaining delivery and all that sort of stuff. Yet one person didn't have the power, with I think about 6 people that knew, to completely pin something that took X amount of time. I mean, really, I don't think you can answer the question, but how do we resolve that, and how can people of such big strategic nature and big things make that impact, is my question.
Thank you. We've got one here and then immediately behind.
Hi, my name is Ying Xiao, and I'm from the Restoration Renewal Program for the Houses of Parliament. And I actually grew up in Singapore, so thank you for that interesting reference to the Singapore system. But I do agree with you. Obviously, there are issues in Singapore. But my question is not about that. We can have an offline conversation about that later. How do we hold governments accountable for changing their mindset? You talked about, depending on how the political winds are blowing at that time, they may change their minds. We've seen it with HS2. So actually, what is a good way to make sure that they are accountable despite changes in the parties, so that if they do change their minds, they are accountable at the end of the day, because there's a big bill that everyone's paying as taxpayers when things gets changed up, and who's accountable, who pays that?
Thank you. And if you could pass it to literally 2 seats behind you. There's a third question. Are you okay with taking 3?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Julie Wood from MacDonald and Vice President of the Institution of Civil Engineers. So my question's really about the general public, and are we articulating well enough not just the beneficial outcomes of projects, but also the implication of not carrying out the major infrastructure that we're talking about. The future opportunities for children's children and so on. And I'm not sure we always really articulate that well.
Let me start with that last part. As the political scientist, it's the thing, or someone who studies public opinion, it's the thing I'm closest to. I think people are kind-hearted about these questions, as we saw from the net zero support, right? A general vision about what the future should look like is something that can command extremely high public support in this country. And of course, as I mentioned, many of the pieces of infrastructure that we do have now that were probably highly controversial at the time are much beloved. So the hard part is the moment that the general becomes specific. And part of the problem there is it moves away from a national vision that can be sold by a national politician to local fights with very clear losers. Any of you who read your local newspaper will know that the absolute catnip for local readers is about new building projects, and especially new building projects being turned down, right? That is all the Oxford Mail is 25 new houses about to appear here, 13 houses cancelled there, as if Oxford wasn't having a huge housing crisis. I think part of the problem, and part of the way, and this now gets to the point about what can we do about this. I think that we are having a revolution in local government in the UK that we're not quite aware of, which is the mayoralities. I mean, they're pretty new, except for London, which people have got used to. The metro mayorships are a potential place to do this well. That would give us local government that could be accountable and could respond more effectively without, how do you hold a government accountable when the Prime Minister changes several times between elections? That's, I mean, I don't know as a political scientist how you do that, but if you have, instead of your accountability being at a single point, which is a national government in power, your accountability is about local politicians, of whom there are many, and of whom their electoral cycles might differ from the national political system, then I think we would find it easier to have a direct voice as a public at the level that it's needed to happen in terms of infrastructure. Because I concur with the point you made up there. A single person in number 10 or in the Treasury, I'm ex-Treasury, right, can make decisions that have hundreds of millions and often billions of value overnight because they're worried about the polls or because they're worried about what the budget will look like. And a system that allocated out some of that responsibility in a more decentralized fashion, I think, would be good for this country.
And did you want to address any of the other?
I feel that was an attempt to address all three in one answer.
So I think we have got time
as good as I was going for.
One more round of questions before we have to break for supper. So somebody's got the mic already, and then if a couple diagonally forward. So 1, 2, 3.
Thanks. Frederick Levy from Turner and Townsend. Dipping my toes into political science, where do you see, I guess, in the UK and then also globally, the future of liberal democracy to tackle climate change?
Yeah, thanks. Nick Ellis, I'm the CEO of AWE. I was going to ask you a question, Ben, if you could write another book, actually, which is Why Public Inquiries and Judicial Reviews Fail. But I'm sat next to Billy, who is the lawyer who runs our infrastructure business, and I thought that probably wasn't right. So I've got a different question. I've sat in front of the Public Accounts Committee on numerous occasions, being questioned over how we're spending the public's money on major programmes. And in every count, I found that the role of the National Audit Office has been to identify how the individual pound spent delivers value for money, but have absolutely no idea how major programmes spend in a value for money sense, or how portfolios actually deliver. And I think that gives mill to the grist in terms, or grist to the mill, sorry, in terms of politicians being able then to challenge the way in which our major infrastructure projects are delivered. Because I don't think we're actually looking at the value in the right way. So I'd be really interested to hear your views on that.
And then there was a third question.
Julie Wood, KPMG. My question is quite a short one. How do you incentivize innovation with so much uncertainty? Is it a capability question or other?
Yes, so on the latter, I mean, obviously, as someone who works at the University of Oxford, innovation is constrained for us in a variety of ways, but the most important is in terms of planning, where we can't build labs near the University of Oxford. Dry labs, wet labs, it's impossible. So that kind of innovation, one thing that people often forget is that we have an extremely successful services sector in this country, but it still requires us to build things for the services sector. We can't just assume that it's all done over a computer. Secondarily, you need some kind of stability in terms of investment taxation. We don't have a very stable tax system. Our tax system could be worse. It could be America's tax system, so it could be extraordinarily complex as well as unstable. But I do think a lack of stability in terms of investment environment is a challenge, and that challenge probably isn't going away. But the planning part is important for innovation, and I think it's often undervalued, including with innovation that people don't think is going to require a lot of concrete, but often does. The National Audit Office, God bless. Well, they're very good at measuring the depth of the bark on the trees while ignoring the thickness of the forest, and maybe that's what they're set up to do. Far be it from me to say, well, create another institution that does vision, because I don't know if you want your vision to be audited, because that feels that it could be even more out of the control of project managers. Although, some of these French examples are about, you do all the vision stuff at the start and you make decisions about what you think the vision should like, but then you stick to it. And then I suppose if you stick to it, then worrying about the pounds and pence at the end is less of a problem. But not being able to see the vision at all, I think that's a challenge. We do have, and I really strongly remember this from working in the training sector, we had too many entities there. We had sector skills councils, regional development agencies, it's all RIP, but they were lots of different institutions with similar roles, and we have that with infrastructure in this country too. Now, there's some talk about whether things are going to get merged. Generally speaking, I think an environment where project managers have to go to this organization to see how it audits you, and then another organization that checks your vision, and a third organization that plans out infrastructure is just going to delay the process ever further. So, I don't want to burn down every institution and start again, but we probably wouldn't have the set of institutions that we currently have now if we designed them from scratch. Climate change in liberal democracy is going to be a lot harder than we thought it would be about 3 or 4 years ago. So now let me put my comparative politics hat on and finish on this topic. The Dutch elections, of the last few elections, have been totally roiled by debates about insecticides and pig farms, which it doesn't feel like the kind of things that normally would drive politics. But that's led the Farmers' Party and the PVV and other Dutch more populist parties to be extremely successful, noting that Green New Deal style policies, although I don't think these directly come from the European Green New Deal, have costs, and have costs to particular, often sentimentally symbolic groups like farmers, and this is just the beginning of that cycle. We saw it with ULEZ here. So I think two things that are very positive have happened with global warming. The first is that everybody knows about global warming. Right? The kind of initial role of Extinction Rebellion or Greenpeace or whatever to expose people to the reality, I think, has largely been won. Most people agree it's happening. And secondarily, most people are willing to do something about it in the future and have got their politicians to sign up for that. Part 3, which is the individual policies that need to happen, that have extremely clear losers, and for whom a lot of political rhetoric has been like, well, too bad, do you want the world to heat up and burn? That has not been effective, and we're going to need to find a new language that's less hectoring and more acknowledging of the costs associated.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. I think, incredibly sadly, we are out of time, and I know there were many, many more questions, hands going up, so I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to factor them into the Q&A session. I think it's over for now for us to thank you for the fantastic lecture and the Q&A session that we've had, Ben, and you are staying for the evening, so there may be opportunities for people to come and say hello to Ben over supper. Thank you very much.